All right. Welcome back to Instrument Pilot Operations. Today we are going to be in Unit 2. This is kind of our introduction to IFR operations. We're talking about safe and efficient IFR operations. So let's dive in. So as an overview for this lesson, we're going to be talking about some really basic items when it comes to IFR flight. So most of this should probably be review to some level for you guys. We're going to be talking about, we're going to be defining VFR, marginal VFR, and IFR. Again, private pilot, we should have talked about that quite extensively. Understand the basic requirements to file an IFR flight plan and act as PIC during an IFR flight. So what are the basic criteria of doing an IFR flight? Then I want you to understand the conditions leading to spatial disorientation. So we're going to be talking about some human factors. And again, it's mostly going to be review. We've talked a lot about this in private pilot operations. So we're just going to see how that comes into play during instrument operations. And then obviously understand how to overcome spatial disorientation and evaluate scenarios related to spatial disorientation. So our objective, this unit objective, is to exhibit knowledge of the function and operating principles of flight instrument systems, crew resource management, to include crew communication and coordination, and proper techniques for controlling an aircraft by reference to flight instruments, with emphasis on safe and efficient operations of aircraft under instrument flight rules and conditions. So broad overview, how do we operate as instrument pilots? What are the things that we have to be aware about? These are the subjects that we're going to be talking about in Unit 2. Airman Certification Standards, the ACS. So what are you, as a student trying to obtain your instrument rating, what tasks must you accomplish or demonstrate an understanding of? So to start us off, Task 1A, Pilot Qualifications. Applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risks, to include failure to ensure fitness for flight and physiological factors that might affect the pilot's ability to fly under instrument conditions. Again, we are relying heavily on our instruments. That is what instrument flight is. And so we have to be very careful, for one, about fitness of flight. That's always true, regardless of whether you're VFR or IFR. And then the physiological factors. So a lot of the illusions that we experience while flying are going to be amplified in the instrument, under instrument flying. So a lot of those illusions that we learned in private pilot could easily be avoided just by looking outside, because we have the advantage of being able to look outside under VFR. But under IFR, we do not have that advantage. We aren't able to use our horizon as a reference to gain our bearings. So we have to rely on instruments. So because of that, the illusions are a big deal. And then Task 4A, Instrument Flight. Applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risks with situations that can affect physiology and degrade instrument cross-check, spatial disorientation, and optical illusions. So those are our Airman Certification Standards. References. So we are going to be in the Instrument Flying Handbook. So we will reference this a lot. This is the kind of the equivalent to the PHAC, if you guys remember from private pilot ground school. The Instrument Flying Handbook, or the IFH, is our equivalent. So that's what we will use a lot in this course. So for this unit, we are in Chapter 3, or Human Factors. And then also, we're going to be referencing the AIM, Aeronautical Information Manual, Chapter 8, Medical Factors for Pilots, or Medical Facts, for pilots. I highly recommend, at this point, it's probably a good idea. You should have either a digital copy or a physical copy of the AIM. My recommendation is that you should have a copy, specifically, whether it's digital or physical, that you can put bookmarks in, that you can highlight. Maybe you can put note cards in there. Just because we're getting to a point in our flight training where you should be referencing, especially the AIM and the FAR, the regulations a lot. And you should start to become pretty comfortable with where information is in the FAR AIM, how to read it, where to find very specific things. Because as you progress through your flight training, more than likely, you guys will probably be becoming flight instructors. And at that point, you need to be able to teach this material. You need to be able to find it and dive really deep into the source material. So for us, the AIM, it has a lot of source material on a lot of this content. Obviously, the Instrument Flying Handbook is a great explanation of a lot of these things, but still, the AIM is kind of serves as your bread and butter. That's always kind of a starting point. Same with the FAR, the regulations. So my recommendation, buy the physical book, start making highlights, start bookmarking things, or download a digital copy. And if you're using an iPad or whatever, put it in Kindle, put it in an app that will allow you to highlight and save those highlights so that you can always go back and reference those. So that's just my recommendation moving forward, because you're going to be using it a lot, especially if you intend to flight instruct. All right, let's dive into it. So to start off, let's define VMC versus IMC. We talk a lot about VMC in private pilot because we are learning to fly visually. We are learning to fly with reference to our horizon, or with reference to what's happening outside the aircraft. So none of this should be new. This should all be review. We've talked about what is VMC and what is IMC in the past. But as a refresher, remember VMC stands for Visual Meteorological Conditions. IMC stands for Instrument Meteorological Conditions. VMC and IMC. So these are referenced a lot. VMC versus IMC. You will hear those acronyms often. For VMC, we have to have two conditions need to be met. Your ceilings, so your cloud cover, needs to be greater than or equal to 1,000 feet AGL. So if you're on the ground and you have clouds above you, a layer of clouds above you, that means that you need to have 1,000 feet between you and the cloud, 1,000 feet AGL. And the visibility needs to be greater than or equal to 3 statute miles. If one of those conditions is not met, then we are in IMC. So let's say the ceilings are above 1,000, but they're less than 3. That means that you would be in IMC. So if only one of those conditions is met, then you are in what we consider to be instrument meteorological conditions. So again, if the ceiling is anything less than 1,000 feet AGL, or if your visibility is anything less than 3 statute miles, then you are in IMC. Obviously, when we were private pilots, when we were getting our, we were in private pilot ground school, we learned this because we always want to stay in visual meteorological conditions. So that's why we spent a lot of time defining that and learning that. But now that we're learning to be instrument pilots, we are allowed to fly into IMC. So we are allowed now with that rating to fly into the clouds. So again, this is why we're defining these two things, because we're now going into the world of Instrument Flight Rules, or IMC. So here we have a METAR. We have two examples. Looking at these examples, you should be able to discern whether or not you're in IMC or VMC. So maybe take a second, pause the video, and just look at these two METARs and assess whether or not it's VMC or IMC. So for this first one in KCAR, looking through, again, we're looking for two pieces of information. You're looking for your ceilings and then your visibility. So in this first one, I can see my visibility here is at 2 statute miles, and then I have a few clouds at 1,500 feet. I'm broken at 3,500 feet, and I have overcast at 4,700 feet. Now, we have a couple bits of information to work with, but because, if you notice, our visibility is under 3 statute miles, this first one is automatically IMC. Because it only takes one condition to put us into IMC. So in this case, it's 2 statute miles. If we look, when it comes to determining the ceiling, few clouds does not determine ceiling. That is not considered a ceiling. It's either broken or overcast. These two things are what determine the ceiling. So we look at the lowest, in this case would be broken, so it's at 3,500 feet. Remember, you add 2 zeros to the end there. So in that case, our ceiling is well above VMC. Now let's look at the second one, KCLS, and that's Salt Lake City. Again, we're looking for 2 bits of information, our visibility and then our ceilings. So in this case, we have a few ceilings to work with. Our visibility is 4 statute miles. So we are above IMC, or we're greater than 3 statute miles. So far, we are in VMC. And then if we look at our ceilings, we have broken at 9,500, we're broken at 11,000, and broken at 22,000. So we have several layers. We have 3 layers of clouds, and the lowest, 9,500, is well above our 1,000-foot minimum. So Salt Lake City is VMC, visual meteorological conditions. So VMC versus IMC. Is VMC directly defined in the FAR aim? If you notice up here, I have listed the 14 CFR part 91.155. If we go and look that up real fast, 91.155, you should quickly recognize this chart. So you guys in private pilot ground school had to memorize your weather minimums. Now remember, VMC is different than your weather minimums. Each airspace has its own, let me pull up markup real fast. Each airspace has its own criteria. Again, if you've taken private pilot ground school, we've talked about that a lot, why that is. It's meant to separate VFR traffic from IFR traffic, given the airspace that you're in. But if you scroll down, now traditionally when you came to this part to study, you probably just referenced the chart. So you were probably really concerned about 3 statute miles, clear cloud, class Bravo. You probably spent some time memorizing that chart. But if you come down to the bottom, this is where it defines VMC. Though it is not very clear, it doesn't just say VMC equals this. We kind of have to pick it out. So just for your reference, in case anyone ever asks you, how do you define what VMC is? Except provided in 91.157, no person may operate an aircraft beneath the ceiling under VFR within the lateral boundaries of controlled airspace designated to the surface for an airport with the ceiling, when the ceiling, is less than 1,000 feet. Okay, so that's defining the 1,000 foot ceiling, when the ceiling is less than 1,000 feet. And then if you go down a little bit, we read this next part. Unless the ground, so section D1, unless the ground visibility at the airport is at least 3 statute miles. or if the ground visibility is not reported, while operating in the traffic pattern is at least 3 statute miles. So that's where VMC is defined, in case anyone ever asks. All right. VFR, MVFR, and IFR. So VFR, visual flight rules, IFR, instrument flight rules. But what about MVFR? Is that a new set of flight rules? And what does that really mean? Because it's something that we talk about a little bit in private pilot ground school. But what is marginal VFR? We use marginal VFR to help us determine, is it safe to fly? We like to have a buffer zone. So marginal VFR is still VMC. So marginal VFR, still VMC. Looking at that first part there. So we're still, when you are in marginal VFR, you are still operating under visual flight rules, VFR. What MVFR is used for is to help us determine whether VMC is deteriorating or not. So as you know, when you pull up ForeFlight, there's some overlay features that give you colors for different airports. So if an airport is under VFR, the airport shows up as green. If the airport is under IFR, it shows up as red, I believe. And then if it's marginal, it shows up as blue. So it helps us determine, is that airport on the edge? So for MVFR, I believe it's between, I'm going to switch my pen here. If it's between, that's not what I wanted. Let's try this again. If it's between 3 to 5 statute miles, or if it's between 1,000 feet and 3,000 feet, then you're in marginal VFR. Again, you're still operating, it's still VFR. So if anyone asks, you are still VFR if the weather is in between 3 to 5 statute miles and 1 to 3,000 feet. But we define it as marginal. So now we are inching closer to IFR conditions. So as a private pilot, that's where you are left with a critical decision. Is it safe to fly? You have to pay close attention to what the weather is doing if you're going to fly that day. As an instrument pilot, it's not as big of a deal because we are training and to get that license that allows us to fly into IMC, into instrument conditions. So now that we've kind of defined that, we're moving away from VMC and now we are transitioning into our understanding of IMC, operating inside instrument meteorological conditions, is what we call instrument flight rules, or IFR. This is the rating that you're going for. You are trying to become instrument pilots. So in terms of the legal stuff, which we'll talk about later, there's a unit on it, but 14 CFR Part 91, 167 through 199 is instrument flight rules. I think I have that pulled up. So here, again, I like to use Cornell Law for my FAR aim stuff. I think it's just the most well organized. But here you can see Part 91, 167 through 91, 195 to 191, 199. And this is all of your instrument flight rules. That subsection is called instrument flight rules. When you got your private pilot's license, we spent a lot of time in the visual flight rules. So that's where a lot of our information came out of. So again, a lot of stuff that we'll talk about will be coming out of this subsection. So I just want to reiterate, highly recommend that you invest in either a physical FAR aim or have a FAR aim that you have downloaded in an app that you can take notes on, highlight, all that stuff, just so you have it for your reference. So it's something that you can always come back to and reference again. So that's where our visual flight rule, our instrument flight rules are defined in that section. So IFR requirements. So what does it take to fly into IMC? So what is that going to take for us? What things do we have to have? So first, you have to be an instrument rated pilot. That's why you're in this ground school, and that's why you're going to be enrolled in that flight course, is because you want to become an instrument rated pilot. So you'll need that rating. You cannot fly into IMC unless you are an instrument rated pilot. So once you finish this course, once you finish your flight course, you will be an instrument rated pilot, and you can fly into IMC. Next, you have to have an instrument equipped aircraft. We'll talk a lot more about instruments later on. But as you guys remember, when you went through private pilot ground school, there was a lot of equipment required for flight that you had to have on board. That equipment for visual flight is not the same as instrument flight. So if we go back to our FAR aim, if you notice, if you look through the instrument flight rules real fast, if you just scan that list, there is nothing in there about instrumentation, what instruments are required for flight. You see, You see stuff like fuel, IFR flight plan. You do see the VOR equipment check for IFR operations, but there's nothing about what are the required instruments. For that, and again, if we were in an actual class, I would ask you what section or what part of the FAR aim does it discuss equipment required for class or for flight. For that, we need 91-205. This is what lists out all of the equipment that you need. So you probably had to memorize this. If for VFR day, maybe you use the acronym A Tomato Flames. Maybe use the acronym, Atoms to Flee. So there's a couple ways you can memorize the visual flight rules for day, the equipment needed for visual flight rules. But if you scroll down, there's visual flight rules night, what equipment you need for night, and then we have instrument flight rules, or IFR. So here's all the equipment that you would need on an aircraft for instrument flight. So if you want to go flying instrument, this is what you would need. And again, this is all stuff that we're going to be talking about later. We're just referencing it for right now. So we have our instrument equipped aircraft. Check. We need an instrument flight plan. This is where things start to get a little different from our VFR days. Now, if you ask the question, are we legally required to have a flight plan when we go on a VFR flight? And the answer is tricky. Good aeronautical decision-making says yes. If I go on a VFR flight, I should have a flight plan. That is just smart. Do I legally have to file one? And the answer is no. But if you remember, in 91-103, that section talks about the legal things you're required to do for pre-flight. So that was our pre-flight requirements. Now, for a VFR flight, we are required to make ourselves aware of all information for that flight. If you remember, lengths of runways, weather information, fuel information, stuff like that, we were required to know before we go on a flight to a different airport. So, do you have to file a VFR flight plan? You technically don't have to. But if you do it, if you make a flight plan, a VFR flight plan, you are accomplishing 91-103. So it's really smart to always flight plan. If you're going to a different airport, always have a plan, always flight plan. You are in some ways legally required to. Now, when it comes to IFR flight, how is this different? You are required to file an IFR flight plan. That is a non-negotiable. If you're going to go on an IFR flight plan, it has to be filed. Now, if you remember, when you were a when you were in private pilot ground school, we talked about filing a flight plan. So let's say we make our flight plan. Let's clean it up a little bit. So let's say we make a flight plan, FP for flight plan. Now, as a VFR pilot, you would have filed that with flight services. Remember, flight services is not ATC. They are funded by the government, but they are technically not a government agency. They just provide a lot of services to us as private pilots. When you're flying IFR, when you fly an instrument flight plan, ultimately ATC is going to have your flight plan because they are the ones. It's controlled airspace. Remember, we are IFR pilots. We're being controlled the entire time. To do that, ATC needs to know where we're going, what we're doing, our altitude, all of that information. So ultimately, your flight plan is going to end up with ATC. So as an IFR pilot, you will still file through flight services, but if it's an IFR flight, they send that information to ATC so that it can be approved. And so that when you take off, they know exactly what you're doing, what Victor Airways you're going to fly on, what airport you're going to, what capabilities you have, because what approach we do is all dependent on that. So that's why flight planning for IFR is a non-negotiable. You have to do it. And then with that, your IFR flight plan then determines if you get a clearance or not. So you need an IFR clearance. So what's going to happen is, as we'll learn later, you file your flight plan. Your flight plan, you file it with flight services. Flight services sends it to ATC. And then when you are in the plane, when you're getting ready to taxi, that is when you would call to get your clearance. So ATC would hopefully have your flight plan on file. You call them up, you tell them your call sign. They find your flight plan, and then they will give you your clearance. So we're going to learn all about IFR clearances later on. But once you have that clearance, then you are cleared to fly. But you cannot fly, this is very important, you cannot fly into IMC conditions without an IFR clearance. Okay, and then once, also kind of thrown in there is special VFR. Now, what is special VFR? We talked about that in private pilot ground school, so you should be familiar with it. Special VFR allows you to take off into certain conditions. So some IMC conditions that would allow you to fly VFR, but it's kind of a hybrid between IFR and VFR. It's when you intend to do a VFR flight, but maybe the airport you're taking off from has just some bad weather. And you know, based on the weather, that once you get out of that airport, the weather will be fine. It's just very located around that airport, you have some IMC conditions. So special VFR is a kind of a hybrid scenario where you could take off under IMC conditions but continue the flight via VFR. And we'll discuss that again later in the course. So inadvertent IMC, what is it? That is your unplanned, unexpected, and unintentional entry into instrument environment. Inadvertent IMC accounts for a lot of general aviation accidents. So looking at this little piece of a report here, visual flight rules, VFR, into instrument meteorological conditions. Accidents are a major concern in the aviation industry. More than 70% of fatal weather-related accidents involved general aviation pilots operating under VFR that continued into IMC. The results indicated that VFR IMC pilots were more likely to commit a decision error, experience a perceptual error, and commit a violation than the rest of the general aviation community. So what this is saying is that there are a lot of cases of VFR pilots who make poor decisions and fly into IMC, and they crash because of it. So it's something to be aware of. And obviously, you guys are getting your instrument rating to avoid this problem, right? Even if you take off VFR and you're instrument rated, and all of a sudden clouds start building up, unexpected clouds, or you're in a situation where if you want to continue, you have to fly into the clouds. Excuse me. As an IFR rated pilot, as an instrument rated pilot, you can just request an IFR flight plan. So even in the air, you can request a clearance into the clouds. So that's kind of the point here, is that with your instrument rating, you're avoiding one of the most fatal accident areas in the general aviation pilot community. So having your instrument rating is huge for safety of flight. And again, inadvertent IMC encounters are some of the most demanding, disorientating, and dangerous conditions a pilot can experience. These encounters result in the highest percentage of fatal injuries from helicopter pilots. NTSB 2011 figures show that 45 of the 52 IMC accidents occurring that year were fatal. That is 86% giving you an 86% chance giving you a 14% survivability rate if you go into double IMC. So it's a big deal. You need to be very cautious if you're a VFR pilot flying in that marginal range, flying in marginal VFR. And so obviously having your instrument rating helps you avoid this scenario altogether, because you will be trained to fly in that environment. So your instrument rating is a great thing to have. So now we're going to transition into what happens when you fly into that environment. You can, if you're not prepared for it, you can experience spatial disorientation. This is the disagreement between what you see and what you feel. And it can lead to a lot of different phenomena. Motion sickness. So you can get sick more than likely if you have passengers. They're the ones that are going to get sick. So that could be a big deal. And then you just have this disagreement between what you see and what you feel. This can lead to a lot of different illusions that we'll talk about in a second, that can lead to accidents, into see-fit scenarios where you crash into terrain because of an illusion that you had when flying into the clouds. So more common in IMC, so flying into clouds is obviously the number one kind of scenario that we want to be aware of and train for. Because again, you can't see, and your senses are going to be experiencing different sensations. Precipitation can cause spatial disorientation, and flying obviously in the dark at night can cause spatial disorientation. So these are common conditions that can lead to some bad scenarios, as we saw in those last few slides. Great articles to read, boldmethod.com, great resource. I highly recommend going to their site and looking around. But boldmethod.com has a lot of resources. So like if you click on this link, it's a great article on 6 ways pilots get confused in the clouds and how to prevent spatial disorientation. So spatial awareness. Your body has the ability to be spatially aware, whether that's through your vision. So obviously we see, and that allows us to be spatially aware of what's around us. We have our vestibular system. That's your inner ear. So inside your ear, you have this system. It acts as kind of like accelerometers or gyros to help you sense what position your body is in. And then you have your kinesthetic sense, and those are your nerves. So your limbs and your body parts have the ability to kind of feel where they are based on what you're seeing and what you're feeling. So that's what creates our sensation of position. That's what helps us know where we are in 3-dimensional space. And then all of that is constantly adapting as we move. So your head movements and your body movements change your spatial awareness or your sensation of position. Um, so as we've talked about before, if you took private pilot ground school, you know that when you close your eyes and you move around, this can create different sensations. So when you take away your vision or you take away one of your senses, now all of a sudden you can get mixed signals, which can lead to spatial disorientation. So there are a couple illusions in flight that we have to be aware of. Again, a lot of this is stuff that we've talked about. Um, but a good way to remember some of these illusions is the acronym ICE flags. ICE flags. We have inversions, Coriolis, elevator, false horizons, the leans, autokinesis, the graveyard spiral and spin, and somatographic. And a lot of these we've talked about. So again, if you took private pilot ground school, you probably learned about a lot of these illusions, as well as these other illusions over here. These don't fall under the ICE flags acronym, but some other illusions we have to be aware of, such as runway width. So if you guys remember, depending on how wide or narrow the runway is determines how high you feel. Not how high you actually are, but how high or how low you feel. So landing on a narrow runway, you feel high, so you fly lower than you should, or you fly below glide path. Runway lighting, if the lights are very dim, so if you're landing on a runway that has low intensity lights, you're gonna feel higher than you actually are because the lights look like they're farther away. So that creates another illusion. On the runway slope, if the runway's sloping away from you or down, you're going to feel closer to the runway. If it's sloping up, you're going to feel farther from the runway. Same thing with fog, haze, rain, and snow. When those are present, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're in IMC, but they do degrade our vision. So things can seem farther away than they actually are. We learned about this in private pilot ground school, but these are going to be amplified now that we are instrument pilots, because if maybe you've never thought about landing the plane as an instrument pilot, but with all of our instruments, it allows us to fly through the clouds up to a certain point. And depending on the instrumentation you have, if you're doing a precision approach, you're going to break out of the clouds at the very last minute. And so all of a sudden, the runway is just going to pop up out of nowhere. And so these illusions, if we're not prepared for them, can really take us off guard. So if I pop out of the clouds and all of a sudden I see the runway, and the runway is very wide, it's a lot wider than I'm used to, I'm going to feel low. And so I might panic. I might apply power to gain some altitude. And that might cause me to do a missed approach. And when you're instrument now, you have to go through this whole procedure of doing a missed approach. So it's a big deal. These factors become a big deal as an instrument pilot, because now instead of being able to see the runway for a long time as we approach it, it's just going to pop up and appear out of nowhere once we pop out of the clouds. So we have to be very careful and very aware of these illusions. So I highly recommend with these other illusions, I don't want to spend too much time going in depth on these, but I would highly recommend maybe just Googling ICE flags, illusions, or finding these in the book and just reviewing these. I know we've gone over a lot of these before. Yeah, just make sure you have a good grasp on a lot of these illusions. We can't do this because we are not together, so we don't have to worry about this slide. So how to avoid and overcome illusions. Before, as private pilots, as visual pilots, I should say, VFR pilots, A lot of these illusions, again, aren't that big of a deal because we are in a visual environment. So we can always trust what we see outside to tell us what's going on. When I approach a runway, I can usually see the runway for a long time, so I can get used to how wide it is. I can get used to the lighting, I can get used to the slope or the fog or the haze. So those things are there working for my advantage when I'm VFR. But when I'm IFR, now I don't have that visual reference, and all of these things are going to be amplified. So they're going to be a lot worse. So, how do we avoid and overcome these illusions in an instrument environment in IMC flight? The first thing is always plan ahead. Again, IFR flight, you have to plan an IFR flight plan, so there's no getting around that. So, know the weather, know what the weather is going to be like. Make sure, again, your flight planning, your departure, your en route, arrival, and approach, you have all of those things planned out. So you're very aware of what you're going to be doing. Big thing is cockpit organization. A lot of these illusions, like if we go and look back at the Coriolis illusion, so if you've, in the Coriolis illusion, if you've been in a turn for a long time, so let's say you're in a hold, your body has kind of settled into that turn. So now your body thinks you're in straight level flight. And then if you were to make like an abrupt movement, so let's say your flight bag is in the back seat and you realize you need to get a chart or you need to grab your iPad out of that back seat. So now you make an abrupt head movement, you turn around, and all of a sudden you're going to feel like the aircraft is in a different orientation. You're going to feel like the world is kind of tumbling. And so that could cause you to make abrupt control movements, which could cause other bigger issues. So a big part of avoiding these types of illusions is having good cockpit organization. So that means, having a good idea of where do you want, like what do you need in flight? Where do you want all of those things to be? If you're using your iPad, where is your iPad going to be set up? Some students have them on your lap, so you can have kind of a knee board with your iPad on it. Some get like a window mount, so they can mount it to the window and have it right there in front of them. Or maybe you keep it in like a pocket and you pull it out from time to time. Or maybe you have charts and maps. Maybe you have a water bottle. Maybe you have a flashlight if you're flying at night. Whatever the case is, make sure you have your cockpit organized in such a way that you don't have to make these abrupt movements or you have to reach around to grab stuff. Cockpit management or cockpit organization is a really big deal. Automation management. A big part of these illusions is trusting your instrument. So we'll kind of jump down here to the bottom. You always want to trust your flight instruments. So that means you should always be referencing your instruments in instrument flight. So with automation management, you want to make sure that you know the system you're going to be flying. So if you're in the G1000 in our Cessna 172 or even the Diamond, the DA-42, you want to make sure you understand those systems. You want to understand how they work, how to manage them, so that when you're flying, you have to make changes to your flight plan or you have to enter in information that it is not taking your attention away from your instruments too long, because you have to be able to trust those, and to do that you have to be looking at what they're telling you. If you don't look at your flight instruments, your body is going to naturally progress back to what you're feeling. Okay, that's going to be its first inclination, is to always go by what you're feeling. So if you look away for a little bit and all of a sudden it feels like you're in a turn, you might abruptly go to trying to level out your wings. And if you don't look at your instruments, maybe you were already wings level, and now you've put your aircraft into a turn, and even though you think you're level, whatever the case may be, it can put you in a bad spot. So understand the systems in your aircraft, understand how they work, and get good at managing them before you're in the plane. So get a hold of a G1000 trainer or whatever the case may be to practice that automation. And that kind of feeds into training and experience. The more you train, the more you're going to be prepared to fly in the clouds, um, to fly in those types of conditions, and you will be prepared for it. You will know what those illusions are like, and you will simply be able to tell yourself not to trust your body, but to trust your flight instruments. You'll get used to that. Hopefully, that becomes your first inclination, is to always look at what your instruments are telling you, as opposed to what your senses are telling you. So all of that's going to come through training and experience. Always avoid rapid airplane movements. When you guys start flying instrument, one of the first things you do is learn uh, a lot of the basics in controlling the aircraft by reference to your instruments. Everything you do, you want to be slow and smooth. That's why we have the standard rate turn. We want to get good at controlling the aircraft in a very smooth motion, because we're going to be in the clouds. And if we have rapid movement of the airplane in the clouds, it's going to lead to these illusions. So that's what we want to avoid. And then with that, so you avoid rapid airplane movement and avoid rapid head movement. So when you're an instrument pilot, you're in your seat, you're in the aircraft. You want to do everything slowly and smoothly to help avoid those illusions. Because again, if you turn your head too rapidly, it could lead to those illusions, and you could react to those illusions, and it could get you in a bad spot. So always make sure everything you do should be slow and smooth, slow and steady, to avoid those illusions. All right, so that's what we have for Unit